All right, we begin here in Nigeria. Latest economic growth figures for the second quarter, that's April through June. Of course, 2.51% are the numbers that came in year on year. First quarter, 2.31, a slowdown from the last quarter of second quarter of 2022, 3.54%. We also have the revised unemployment figures according to the new methodology used by the Bureau of Statistics in accordance with the International Labour Organization. And of course, that sees our fourth quarter 2022 unemployment coming in at 5.3%. First quarter of this year, 4.1. It was 33% in at the last time the previous methodology was used. We are incredibly ecstatic to have Dr. Yemi Kale, who is a partner and chief economist at KPMG Nigeria. He's also former Statistician General of the Bureau of Statistics. We also have Gbemisola Alonge. She's the Senior Economics Analyst with economic think tank Stears, whom I subscribe to and who writes great stuff. All right, good morning to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Kale, I have to begin with you. Great to see you again. From a policy standpoint, what's your take on these numbers?
Well, firstly, thank you, Rotus, for inviting me back. Well, I don't think the numbers were surprising. I think it was expected. Q2 was a transition period and things tend to slow down. And if you add the fact that consumption expenditure has been squeezed for quite a while, and the economy has been slowing down as far as consumption expenditure is concerned, as far as private investment as well has been squeezed. So those are the two largest components of your GDP. So I wasn't really expecting anything significantly better than this. And actually, I think it's going to continue in the third quarter because, again, that's actually where further squeezing of household consumption was done with the reforms. Yes, they were the right things to do, but they're going to have that impact on household consumption expenditure. Private investment is also struggling with higher costs and then with reduced demand. And then when you add the fact that the oil sector is still contracting, I have a theory that, well, it's not a theory, it's fact, that the economy is 62% of the economy is directly and indirectly dependent on what happens in the oil sector. So your oil sector remaining in contraction, you're really not going to be able to grow significantly more than the 2-3% that you have been growing until you fix that oil sector because it's really, really tight. So it's not particularly surprising. As long as this continues, it's even slowed down in the first month of the third quarter oil production. So as long as this continues, we're going to have that period of slow growth going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Kale. Gbemisola, for the average man, woman on the street, how does one take in these figures? What are your thoughts on the numbers?
So, I mean, like Dr. Kale said, it reflects the situation happening in Nigeria and the situation that Nigerians are very familiar with. In the last year and couple of years, in fact, since COVID, Nigerians have witnessed, a slowdown in business activity. And I mean, it was only just getting back to normal. Even in Q1 2023, we saw, due to the cash crunch, Nigerians felt the impact of a slow growth as well. So with the new governments in place, things were almost getting back to normal and then reforms were implemented and then Nigerians are back to a slowdown. So it reflects what Nigerians are already familiar with. But more importantly, it tells us the sectors where, there's economic activity and there's growth. And typically when we think about recessions or 3% growth here, 2.5% growth there, it actually translates into businesses shutting down in these sectors and businesses growing. So in sectors like the ICT sector where, it has continued to expand over time, we see growth and it's reflective of how businesses in that sector are doing. So if you hear of those businesses, recording profits and things like that, it's reflective of what's going on in the GDP. But then in sectors, like oil refining that Dr. Kale referred to earlier, that has been in a recession for a while, that kind of thing also reflects how businesses in that sector are performing. It's no surprise that some of these businesses have divested some of their investments out of Nigeria. So it just reflects to Nigerians how businesses in different sectors are performing and how Nigeria is at the moment from a business or macro perspective.
Dr. Kale, you touched on the oil sector. President Tinubu has declared a state of emergency in food insecurity. Should the same be done for oil, since the oil sector has been contracting for multiple quarters now and struggling?
Well, I'm not fully versed with the reasons the government would declare a state of emergency. I think the reasons why the oil sector has been contracting, we're very familiar with it. There's very little investment in the oil sector for a long time, and the reasons are very clear. Most of the world is trying to move away from oil to start with. additionally, it's all theft and vandalism and different things. I'm not sure if that's, it's just fix the security and get it working. I'm not sure. I don't think it's an all emergency problem. I think it's just, it's a huge revenue for those that are involved in the business. And when you have people making billions of dollars a day from that practice, it's going to be extremely difficult to get it removed. Nevertheless, if you add the fact that we're even very close to the newly the limit set by OPEC anyway, there's really not much we can do in terms of further growth in that sector. But yes, I don't think it's that difficult to fix the security issues. I've actually recommended sensors on the pipelines, so that when there's a breach, there's a monitoring station that can dispatch security, and you can pinpoint exactly where that's happening. And this is not expensive. Get your security personnel to wherever that breach is, and try and see if you can and solve that problem. And if the concern is that the security personnel might be involved in the entire thing, then why don't you start rotating the security personnel on a regular basis? Every quarter you get fresh people in there. So before they can even get into the system, a new batch has come in. I mean, there are ways that it's fixing the security issues. I don't think it's declaring a state of emergency that makes it work. We don't need to declare a state of emergency to fix the issue. I think you just have to fix security and take it seriously. We did that. If you notice, it improved. That whole, there's a new sheriff in town feel. It started improving, and then when people get comfortable again, they go back to it. And that's basically what it is. You have to deal with the security issues, the incentive to make a lot of money from stealing crude and destroying things. And if you do that, I think you fix the oil problem. But I don't think it's a state of emergency that is going to solve that problem.
Let me stick with you, Dr. Kale. You mentioned, of course, earlier about how the direct, indirect effects of the wider economy based on what happens in the oil sector. Nigeria's economy is just diversified, right? Is it Nigeria's income stream that is not diversified?
Well, yes. I always say that we like to say Nigeria's economy is diversified. It is. You have an oil sector that contributes 6, 7, 8. I'm not sure what it is this quarter.
5.
It's now down to 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Percent of GDP, and then you have under 41 activities, I think, that are not done. But the problem is that, like I said, 62% of those activities are dependent on what happens to oil. So, for example, manufacturing is not an oil activity, but it's significantly dependent on oil receipt, on foreign exchange coming from oil. So if you don't get the foreign exchange coming from oil, then it's going to hit the manufacturer. You can say it's diversified technically because it's not an oil activity, but the success of that activity, and many of them, is dependent on oil. So you only have about 30% of your economy that is not significantly dependent on oil. And those sectors tend to grow. The arts, entertainment, recreation, you see that for the most part, they tend to continue to grow because they're not really as directly tied to oil. Same thing with telecommunication services. The services part is not significantly dependent on oil. So it will continue to grow regardless of, to an extent, what is going on with oil. But sectors like manufacture, like public finance under the GDP, to an extent by trade, because a lot of trade is also imported. Those kind of sectors will struggle to grow if you don't get your oil sector. So we are diversified on paper, but in terms of the supply-use tables, the input-output tables that show the interrelationship between different sectors, we're really still tied to whatever happens to oil. And we have to break that bond. Now, the funny thing is that to actually break that bond, we need to actually fix the oil sector first, which is actually, that's actually what's happening in UAE, for example. They are using their oil receipts to make themselves not dependent on oil in the future by creating the enabling environment so that other sectors actually can survive without oil. That's actually what we're supposed to be doing. But unfortunately, we are not doing that because we're losing a lot more revenue from oil, and any revenue we generate anyway, it's used to pay huge repayment of huge debt. So we cannot even use that revenue to help our non-oil sector that require that foreign revenues from oil to grow and to pull themselves away from that oil sector. Thanks,
Dr. Kale. Gbemisola, your thoughts on the non-oil sector? I mean, it continues to be what pushes growth, right? But of course, Dr. Kale has already talked about how it's interrelated with the oil sector. What's the outlook, I guess, for non-oil sector? Can it continue to carry this economy, basically?
I think one of the most exciting things about the GDP report for me is how the telecommunication sector has performed over the years.
Yeah?
ICT. So in 2018, it was around it contributed around 8 to 10%, 2018, 2019. And now it's contributing about 16%, if I'm not mistaken. So at the time, in 2018, I mean, crude oil was the third largest contributor to the GDP, and now it's telecommunications. And that's just a testament to how, allowing private sector activity in a sector can promote growth in that sector and, at the end of the day, help the rest of the economy. So seeing how, in the early 2000s, the liberalization of the telecommunications sector and just, the inflow of investors into that sector and just some sort of liberality in how those private sector operators have performed in that sector shows how much can happen when you just let things be.
Right.
When the government,
stays
out of the way, just provides an enabling environment, allows people to do business. So that's very exciting. Other sectors, like Dr. Kale said, are highly, related to or dependent on foreign exchange. So manufacturing, for instance, the manufacturing sector is very volatile. Even when crude oil revenue isn't. Now the subsidies have been removed, but there's still the backlog. People are still unable to access foreign exchange as they should, and that has obviously prevented manufacturers from importing goods and services. So I think going forward, there will still be those sectors. Trade is the second largest contributor, but it's still largely dependent on, it's dependent on consumer behavior. So how are Nigerians performing? If inflation continues to increase, disposable income continues to reduce, and that means not enough people have enough money to even participate in this trade. So sectors like that are highly volatile, but the sectors where, there's a lot of inflow of investment, there's stability in how they operate, they will still continue to see growth, like the ICT sector. It will still continue to expand, and they're basically just scratching the surface, really. So as they keep, innovating and expanding, like you also said, creative arts and entertainment, once you just let them be, once you allow private sector activity happen in full scale, then it will benefit not just the sector, but the entire economy.
Thanks. Dr. Kale, we have talked about agriculture, and I want you to juxtapose something here. When we look at the contributors, most contributing activities to GDP, you see crop production about 20% or so. But then when you break down agriculture itself, 1.5%, livestock is so 20.66, and then we've got trade, health, telcos, and so on at 16%, as Gbemisola just talked about. But when you break down agriculture itself, the subsectors, it's paltry. So are you really getting anything when you've got crop production as the number one contributing activity, and yet you see the wider sector of agri struggling? What's the takeaway there for you?
I think, first of all, the reason why crop production or agriculture in general is still the largest share of GDP, even though it's growing slowly, is mainly because other sectors the sectors that are close in terms of size have been contracting or not growing as strongly. For example, like Gbemi said, ICT has caught up in the last 10 years, and that's likely because it's been growing very strongly, sometimes in double digit, and everything else around it has been contracting. So it's moved from number 5, it's jumped real estate, it jumped it's almost jumped trade, it jumped manufacturing because it was going strongly, all the other sectors were contracting. I think in Nigeria, it's the reason why crop production is the largest, because that's exactly what we do. We have a competitive advantage in crop production because of our huge arable land compared to other sectors like livestock and fishery. So you would always expect that crop production, which can be done all over the country, things like fishing, for example, can't be done all over the country, but it's almost every, I think there's any part of the country that doesn't involve crop production. So it's definitely going to have a larger share of GDP. But you will find a situation where ICT, if it continues its growth, and crop production, if it continues to grow as slowly as it's growing now because of it's still rain-fed, largely rain-fed agriculture, depending on seasonal issues. It's still subjected to security challenges, and so if that continues, you'll find a situation where ICT becomes the strongest and largest share of our GDP, because that is, to an extent, immune from a lot of things. Today, crop production still depends largely on support from the public sector, from the government, for it to thrive. And I'm not even talking about just security. I'm talking about even providing improved seeds and fertilizers and things like that. So if the public sector cannot even get revenue because of back to oil again, right, then it's going to continue. The growth is going to continue struggling. So there's a need to change the manner in which we produce, we do agriculture in Nigeria. Otherwise, at one point, it keeps shrinking. The share keeps shrinking. At one point, it was about 30%, and it's now 20%. It's going to keep shrinking. Other sectors would, particularly from the service sector, that are not as tied to the oil sector, would jump it. And that actually can create a problem, because this is really one of the sectors that we have a huge competitive advantage in.
Thanks, Dr. Kale. Gbemisola, manufacturing. I think we both have already touched on it, but I mean, 2.2% growth or so. There's many subsectors under there that are struggling. Is it? They're still very import dependent. What's your take on the growth we saw there for the manufacturing sector?
I mean, it wasn't surprising. They're largely dependent on foreign exchange, like you said, so they need to import things. And beyond that, even. There's a lot of, I mean, apart from the fact that they need foreign exchange, the cost of doing business in Nigeria over the last 6 months has significantly increased. Last year, we saw diesel prices basically skyrocket. And I mean, businesses had the option of even switching to petrol at the time because petrol was still subsidized. Now, the subsidy has been removed, so they don't even have that option anymore. Electricity is still abysmal. There's also a lot going on in that sector, and they're not getting a lot of support in terms of infrastructure. So something that we typically say at Stears, just for fun, is Nigeria operates a bring your own infrastructure platform where you have to provide your own electricity, water, roads, everything, right? And a lot of that structural deficiency is what is affecting them. Beyond that, like just the fact that Nigeria is still in an FX crunch, and that's likely to continue except there's a significant intervention from the government or whoever, there is still the possibility that this growth might still continue to be very little. And that isn't very encouraging, to say the least.
But it's realistic. Time is of the essence. I have to get to unemployment. Dr. Kale, this is where I come back to you. Maybe I want to get your thoughts. The revision, the methodology, it was in line with international standards. Dr. Kale, the floor is yours. What's your thoughts on this revised?
To end with the controversial one. Okay. Well, two things here. Well, actually, maybe there are actually three, or is it four?
Yeah.
Firstly, the unemployment statistics of MBS has always been in line with national. There's nothing new.
Right.
It has always been published. International benchmark has also always been used in the report. You've always seen that. That's the first thing. Secondly, just to let you know how international standards are set. A group of, for example, United Nations Statistics Commission, which has all the heads of statistics agencies across the country. The idea is we come together, all of us, and we try to find and create a system that all of us can kind of agree with.
Yeah.
So you find agencies like ILO or UNDP or World Bank, whatever it is, trying to get, and in these meetings, countries are arguing because they don't want you to create some kind of methodology that puts them at a disadvantage. So at the end of the day, everybody is trying to push their own narrative. But the stronger countries, the bigger countries are the ones going to determine, at the end of the day, the international best, what we call the international best practice. That's why in this situation, you hear 1 hour is being used, because in many of their countries, 1 hour makes sense. You can, and when people are talking about international comparison, there's no comparison there for two things. 1 hour work in the US or in the UK is not the same as 1 hour work in Nigeria, but because they dominate those conversations, they put a lot more money into it. They dominate those conversations, they're going to probably get their weight for the most part. Nevertheless, you don't find many of these countries using everything. So when you say international best practice, you might have most countries that agree with 1 hour, not all of them, but they might, and even the countries that agree with 1 hour with other aspects of the best, so-called best practice, they will disagree. Some countries will use 15 to 64. Some will use 15 till whenever you want to stop working. Others start with 18. So there are still variations across countries. Countries that are allowed to tweak that. All ILO does give you a baseline, general guidelines, and then countries can tweak around it to suit whatever their needs are. That's how international best practice is set.
Gotcha.
The third part is there's always a mismatch between the producers of data and the users of data, particularly the policymakers, but they hardly ever talk to each other. And I remember when I was there for 10 years, they had to create a system, particularly in African countries, where the ministers of planning and budget, they created a system where they were actually had to talk with the heads of statistics agencies, because the producer of data are just producing their own in line with whatever benchmark, and it doesn't speak to what the policymakers are. And that's the entire point of data, or rather the most important point of data is evidence-based policy decisions, to give policymakers the tools they need to understand the problems, profile solutions, and monitor the impact of those problems. So if you have a situation where the data you're producing and the methodology you are using to produce it is different from the target of the policymaker, there's a problem. So creating that mismatch, I'll give you an example, very quick example, I think out of time. If you remember if you look at the GDP reports and look at transportation, road transportation, you see a huge contraction of 5%.
Yeah.
Even though that was just 1 month of the quarter, the last month. Then if you compare that last month with the inflation numbers, the inflation number suggests that there was very little impact in that month. But and that's because NBS says they are now doing it for only 2 weeks.
Gotcha.
So those two numbers, your data is supposed to tell you a story of the economy. It's not supposed to be just isolated incidences data that don't speak to each other. You have to ensure everything. You're trying to come up with a total picture. So if you are saying, you look at road transportation, you see minus 55% contraction in road transportation, even though it's just 1 month of subsidy removal, and that's probably the reason. And then you look at the same month's inflation numbers, and there's very little impact, nothing happened. And those two numbers are not speaking to each other, and then it misleads policymakers. So and then this is how the 20 hours that was there was used was created. So when I started, it was 40 hours. MBS was computing unemployment as a definition. The definition was if you're not in full-time employment, you're unemployed. And the reason was Nigerian policymakers were promising Nigerians full-time employment. So they want to know whether they are performing in terms of providing full-time, but not 1 hour employment. Now, if you want the policy and the data to match, policymakers either have to now come out and say, all we are guaranteeing Nigerians is 1 hour. Then the methodology works. But if the methodology is focused on 1 hour, and policymakers are trying to look for full-time employment, you're not really helping them.
Gotcha.
And at the end of the day, the data is just there for the textbooks and for researchers and for international comparison, anything like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, policymakers can't use it. And I repeat, the most important use of data is to provide information for policymakers, not for international comparison. International comparison is good, but that cannot be the main. You have to ensure that your policies and your data that you're using to
marry.
Yeah, you're not producing data for the sake of it. Data is for the use. If the data user cannot use the data because it doesn't speak to what they want, then it's just a waste of time. So this is why I resisted for 10 years. Because it did not make any sense in terms of providing the information that policymakers need. So that 20 hours was set because the committee that was set up, which included the ILO, by the way. So there were 30 of them. Included university professors, UNDP, some newspapers, Population Commission, CBN, director, they're all in there that came up with, I didn't come up with this. They presented their findings to me. They decided that 1 hour didn't make any sense because the income, on average, by the way, that you would generate from an hour will not be working. The 20 hours based on if you work for 20 hours, you might be able to generate enough income that might sort of equate to what working 1 hour in the US is. Then you have a bit more comparison.
Gotcha.
So it doesn't. So the way it is done right now, all MBS has done. By the way, MBS is I have to state this before I end, is the official source of statistics.
Indeed.
They are the custodian of all Nigerian statistics. They are the ones that determine, who have the power to determine what they believe is the correct, not me, whether that's ex-tertiary or not, and not anybody else. So if they decide that that's the best move, they have the right to decide.
That's their prerogative, yes.
But as speaking from the other side, it was easier for me to marry both because I'm also an economist, also a data user, and I was also producing data. So it was easier for me to compare both sides and understand that in producing this data for the people that want to use it, it has to make sense. And that's why it seem to be a bit controversial. But no, I'm not, my main point is, do your international comparisons, fine, but ensure that what you produce is actually of use. The use, by the way, when under experience I got from my time there, when you don't fund your statistics agency properly, you have to listen to whatever. So if the World Bank or the UNDP are bringing their money, you're going to do exactly what they want. So if the World Bank insists that you must use 1 hour and they're promoting it, you don't do that. You lose. I had to turn down a lot of funding because I was being compelled to do a lot of things that I felt was not. It will fit international benchmarks and they will do their research and their comparative studies, but it did not help in terms of giving policymakers the tools they needed to fix the country, and that is very, very important. If you tell the policymakers we have a 4% unemployment rate, you're basically telling them there's no unemployment problem.
Right, exactly.
And I'd rather you produce both. You set a benchmark, whatever it is, 20 hours, 10 minutes, whatever it is you want it to be. But that makes sense in the context of what they are trying to deliver. What they claim they are trying to deliver to the Nigerian poor. That's what you measure, that's what you monitor, and that's actually the most important objective of data. And that's my personal view.
Dr. Kale, this is why we brought you on the show. To break it down for the people, it has to be in line with the policy.
You didn't tell me that.
No,
you said you were bringing me to the show to talk about
GDP.
But it's fine. It's fine.
Thank you, Dr. Kale. Gbemisola, what your thoughts? What do you make of this revision?
So like Dr. Sai said, I think first thing is it could easily be misconstrued. People could easily misunderstand what it means. I mean, anyone who's looking at the numbers, and when you see it, it looks like, oh, there's 3% in 2022, 5% in 2021, and 4% now. Like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Who's giving out these jobs,
yeah.
right? So people could easily misinterpret it. But I think one good thing about it, though, is that it highlights a bigger problem that Nigeria has, which is the underemployment problem.
Yeah.
A lot of Nigerians are in wage jobs that are not rewarding and are not, they're largely underemployed rather, in terms of the number of hours they put into the work and in terms of the skills that they have and the kinds of jobs that they do. So we have situations where doctors, for instance, are taxi drivers. I mean, unfortunately, probably because, the medical profession isn't as rewarding. Just a hypothetical example. But we have situations like that, and they're quite rampant. So we have people, underutilizing their skills, and that is underemployment. Another thing is, and yet last year, the World Bank actually released a report about Nigeria's poverty. And one major highlight of that report was that a job in Nigeria is not a ticket out of poverty.
Right.
You can get a job, and even businesses, when you think about companies, informal sector, people always say, oh, the informal sector is large. A lot of times when we think about the informal sector, we think about it in terms of like registration. Is the company registered? Do they pay taxes to the central body? Informal businesses pay taxes, but do they pay taxes to the central collecting body of the state or the federal government, right? But then we tend to forget that there are businesses who are typically registered, but informal in the kinds of wage laws that they follow. Many businesses do not pay like statutory tax payments on behalf of their staff, so things like pension, insurance, NHIS, and all that. A lot of Nigerian businesses do not do that, right? We have situations where, a lot of Nigerian businesses do not even pay up to minimum wage for some of their staff. And no one really pays attention to them because first, they do not even register the staff as part of their staff force or whatever.
Workforce, yeah.
Part of their workforce. So we have a situation where a lot of even registered businesses are practicing informal labor situations, right? And the cost of this is very cost of abiding by formal legal labor laws is a lot higher than not abiding.
Just ignoring them altogether.
Yeah. So I feel like this highlights the problem, a major problem that I guess this new administration can decide to tackle. Underemployment. Nigerians are largely underemployed, and even this, 75% of the Nigerian labor force, for instance, are either own a business, which is most likely small or medium or micro businesses, or they have like subsistence farming. And by the time you think about the kind of value and kind of economic returns that people get from such, is small. It's not too far from like the 1 hour a week job pay. So it's a big.
You get the last. We're out of time. You get a minute left. You get the last word.
I forgot to. The report, for example, focused mainly on percentages. So I think that's another thing. Difficult to actually read anything from percentage numbers. So it doesn't tell you the size of the labor force, the economic active population, or give you an indication of the actual number of people that constitute that 4%. So it's, again, very difficult. If you are looking at, for example, they said the unemployment rate dropped from 5 to 4%. That there can be as a result of so many things. Yeah. It could be that the people in the labor force dropped out of the labor force and those looking for work decided not to look for work again. That's why it dropped. It could be because a lot of jobs were created. But then that's why I said data should speak to each other. You have a situation where unemployment rate is going down from 5 to 4. And in the same quarter, that's the quarter, by the way, of the cash
redesign,
which we expect slow down the GDP of the. So you have to understand how is it possible that unemployment is going down at the time when the economy is actually slowing down, which contradicts most macroeconomic trends. And I'm not saying numbers are wrong. I'm just saying once you are dealing with percentages, it becomes very difficult to actually understand what is going on there. So again, the objective of data is not just to put out numbers on table, it's actually to give policymakers some direction until MBS releases those actual numbers, which I think they say they're going to do. It's really difficult to actually come up with any serious interpretation of whatever those numbers mean.
Dr. Yemi Kale, Partner, Chief Economist, KPMG, Gbemisola Alonge, Senior Economic Analyst at Stears. I thank you both sincerely for joining us today to break down unemployment and GDP. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.